7 years ago, when I was still living in Alabama, the time came for me to renew my driver's license. So I went down to the Department of Motor Vehicles and went through that wonderful process of renewing your driver's license. I filled out all the paperwork with all the vital information they needed and went up to the very friendly agent who was helping me there. She asked if anything had changed since my last driver's license. And I will admit, right at that moment, vanity just took hold of me. And I said, well, now that you mention it, I have lost a little weight since my last driver's license. I'd like that to be noted. Without comment, she just kept on reading my paperwork. And then she looked up at me, and then she looked back down at the paperwork and back at me. And then she says this, and I promise this is exactly what she said. You say here that you have brown hair. Honey, I don't think you can get away with that anymore, she said. What if you were stopped and had to show your ID? It needs to match your look. Your appearance needs to match your ID. That's exactly what she said to me. And a few moments later, I got my first driver's license that said I have gray hair. And it stayed that way until I moved to Georgia. And in Georgia, we don't put hair color on our driver's licenses. But her words stuck with me. Your appearance needs to match your ID. So as Christians, we claim this ID as disciples or followers of Jesus. Does our appearance match our ID? We talk about being believers in Jesus. Do our words, our actions, our appearance, does it match our ID as followers of Jesus? Those words have stuck with me now for 7 years. Your appearance has to match your ID. So most of us in this room would claim that ID of being a Christian. Does your appearance match your ID? When President George H.W. Bush, the first Bush president, was president, he was once confronted by a little boy with a probing question. The little boy said to the president, "Are you really the president?" And President Bush said, "Yes, I really am." And then the little boy looked right at the President of the United States and said, "You got some ID?" And lo and behold, President Bush pulled out his wallet. He had a driver's license. Don't know about his hair color. It had credit cards. He did not have any ID that said he was president. You got some ID? So if we identify ourselves, our ID says we're Christian, does our appearance match our ID? Well, Jesus spoke about that very thing on the night before he died on the cross. We read about this in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. Jesus was with his followers. They have just had the supper. And there Jesus said, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. In fact, Jesus was very clearly saying, you will be identified as my disciples, and your appearance will match your ID if you love one another the same way that I have loved you. And what he was saying was not just an optional suggestion. He said, a new commandment I give to you. The Latin word for commandment, mandatum, is where we get our word Maundy, Thursday. You know, the day before Good Friday is called Maundy Thursday. It was on that day, that night, that Jesus gave this command. And he was really saying, if you're my disciples, if you're my followers, if you bear the identification of being one of mine, then the way that your appearance will match your ID is if you will love one another as I have loved you. That's just like that old campfire song, When I Was a Youth. Let's see, anybody in the choir know this one? And they'll know we're Christians by our love. Thank you. They didn't know that was coming. They'll know we're Christians by our love. Right here, we do a flashback. We move back to the passage that I just read for you from John 12. We flash back from John 13 on that last night of Jesus' life when he says, love one another as I have loved you. We flash back. If this were to be seen on a screen, it might say 5 days earlier. You know how those flashbacks work. And the scene now is another dinner. This is a dinner at the home of Lazarus. Now, if you just read it that way, it doesn't sound all that amazing. The beginning of verse 12 says there was a dinner at the home of Lazarus. But all of chapter 11 in John's gospel tells this amazing story that Lazarus had been dead in the tomb, and Jesus came and raised him from the dead. Remember that story? So now there's a dinner party just right after that, next verse or so. And at the dinner party, Lazarus is sitting right there. Now just imagine that dinner party conversation with a man who had been dead. If you were sitting at the table there, if you were a part of that conversation, what would you want to ask Lazarus at a dinner party given following his death and the fact that he was now living again? So there was a sense of electricity in the house. It wasn't just any old dinner. It wasn't any old birthday dinner. It was a new kind of birth and life celebration. Martha, the sister of Lazarus, was serving. She always did that. We read about that also in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 and following. It was another dinner party at the home of Lazarus. You remember that story? Martha was scurrying about in the kitchen, and she got frustrated because her sister Mary wasn't helping. And she said, Jesus, make Mary help. Martha was the kind who was serving and caring for Jesus by her service. The church needs Marthas, or else we wouldn't get anything done around here. In fact, that wonderful idea of a covered dish meal started in the mind of a Martha long ago. Mary, her sister, was different from Martha. Mary was not the kind to scurry about in the kitchen. In fact, we learn from that story in Luke 10 that Mary was the kind to sit right at the feet of Jesus, to listen, to soak in what he was saying, to ponder and reflect on what he was saying. She was the kind who was a deep thinker and learner, listener. Church needs people like Mary also. Or else we might just scurry about doing all sorts of things and forget to listen and pray and worship and learn. So it was at this dinner party. You have Lazarus, who had been dead and was now answering questions about what it was like. You had Martha scurrying about to get all the food on the table. You had Mary right there, and all of a sudden, it was Mary who interrupted the dinner party with a lavish act of love. She did an amazing thing. She poured nard, which was a very costly perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and then wiped his feet with her hair. Now, that was an extremely intimate expression. This is a culture where out in public, men and women really wouldn't talk to each other. And here, she is taking this expensive nard and is using her own hair to wipe his feet, and the whole house was smelling of this perfume. It was a scandalous act, a lavish demonstration of her love for Jesus. And you know, scandal quickly draws criticism. So Judas was the one to criticize. Why have we let her take this expensive nard? You know, it could be sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor. Now, just to get a perspective on what that means, a laborer would earn 1 denarius for each day of work. Assuming you work 6 days a week, that's a year's wages for one person. So, just to personalize this, you take your annual income, whatever that is, and imagine some kind of perfume worth whatever you make for a year, because that's what 300 denarii was. Would you take that much and wipe it on someone's feet? It was quite a question that Judas was asking. He, as John writes, he questioned the motives of Judas as being a thief who really was more interested in giving this money. But the question always makes sense. Shouldn't we be a little more practical? Shouldn't we not be as scandalous and as extravagant? There are people who are hurting. There are those who are poor. Couldn't that money have been used in a better way? And then Jesus says something amazing. He says, leave her alone. Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor. You don't always have me. Leave her alone. I think that Mary had an understanding about Jesus that some of his own disciples didn't. Maybe it was because she was the kind who would sit at his feet and listen and learn. Maybe she did understand that the way of his ministry was going to end in sacrifice and death. Maybe she understood that kind of thing, and she wanted to prepare him for his burial. But Mary wanted to do this in a way, instead of waiting until he died, she wanted to express her love to him while he was still alive. That makes sense, doesn't it? And so she offered this lavish love as an expression of her devotion to him, because she knew that Jesus was about to offer this amazing love in his own death. I think out of everyone at that dinner party, Mary got it. And that's why Jesus said, leave her alone. She has this this nard for my burial. It makes sense to want to tell someone you love them before they die, though, doesn't it? Some of you who've been around here a number of years will remember the name Dr. Ralph Langley. Do I get any nods that, yeah? He preached here a number of times during interim. He was my revered predecessor at First Baptist Church in Huntsville, Alabama. My legendary predecessor, pastor emeritus when I was pastor there. We were friends and colleagues, a dear friend, Ralph Langley. Well, in October of 2016, long after I had left the church, that church had this great idea. Ralph, by this time, was up in his 90s. He was not in good health. Let's have a big party. Let's do a lavish thing. Let's have a big dinner and pull out all the stops to tell Ralph how much we love him, to honor him. And sure enough, we did, and hundreds showed up. And Ralph laughed, "This is like going to my own funeral." And he loved every minute of it. And I was able to be there, and others came back. And it was an anointing of lavish love for someone who was still alive. And 3 months later, when he died, I was traveling and too far away to make a funeral. And I was so glad I had gone to that dinner party where that lavish anointing of love had happened. And you know, I think Mary was glad of that also. Don't you think? So Jesus said, "Leave her alone," because I think Mary understands what I'm doing. Jesus knew that Mary understood about his life and his death and how his life would be a sacrifice. And the love that Jesus had would be a love that was poured out in a sacrificial way. Jesus said, "Leave her alone," not only because Mary understood that that's the Jesus kind of love, but she understood this is how we are to love one another. And so, in a way that was extravagant and amazing, Mary poured out this love to Jesus. And as she did that, her loving appearance in this radical act was matching her identity as a follower of Jesus. You see, Jesus would show his lavish love on the cross, but a few days earlier, Mary was demonstrating it as she poured the ointment on him. One reason this story may be right where it is in the Gospel of John is because we now need to fast forward a few days back to John chapter 13. You see, just before Jesus told his friends that they were to love one another as he loved them, just before that, Jesus had done something amazing. He had taken a towel and a basin, and he had come and he had literally bent down and he had washed the feet of his followers. Now, there was no expensive nard there, but the act of Jesus was exactly the same kind of act, loving service in a sacrificial way. It's the same kind of thing that Mary did for Jesus. Do you see the connection? And it was scandalous that the Lord and teacher and rabbi would get down and wipe feet, and scandal draws criticism, but this time it was not Judas, it was Peter. And Peter said, "You can't wash me." And yet Jesus just kept going. And just like Mary had continued to anoint his feet, Jesus continued to wash and, in a sense, anoint with love the feet of his friends while they were all still there and living and together. And out of that expression of love, we see a picture of what Jesus wants from us, don't we? We see that picture. At that dinner, the first dinner in John 12 was a dinner to celebrate how life had come back to Lazarus. The dinner in John 13 is a dinner to remember and to prepare for the death of Jesus. But that's the lesson Jesus wanted us to know. That if we're going to be His followers, we demonstrate this lavish kind of love for one another. And Mary got it. And now He's trying to explain it to the disciples, and I think He's wanting to make sure that every one of us understands what that kind of love is all about. That's the secret to our appearance matching our ID. So we bear this ID as a follower of Jesus, but does our appearance match? Are we offering a kind of love at work? In our community, in our church, in our city, to people we know and to people we don't know, are we offering a kind of lavish, extravagant love? Loving others the way Jesus has loved us. I still remember a story that my pastor, when I was a boy, John Claypool, told, and it's stuck in my mind all these years. The story goes like this. There was a young disabled boy who sat in a train station selling trinkets. This is how he tried to get by in life. And one day a man was rushing to a train, and he knocked over this boy and just didn't stop, just plowed on to try to make the train. And then as he did that, the boy spilled and trinkets crashed everywhere and broke. And then another man came by trying to make the same train, but he put his bag down. He took the boy and helped him up on his stool. He put some trinkets back in place. He gave the boy $10 to pay for the broken trinkets, and then he ran on to try to make his train. And as he was running on, the little boy called out and said, wait, mister, are you Jesus?" And the man stopped and turned and shouted back, "Oh, no, son, I'm not Jesus. I'm not Jesus. But I am one of His followers who is trying to do what He would do if He were here." His appearance was matching his ID. I have a minister friend who has an 8-year-old daughter. She loves to go to Ash Wednesday service. And in her church, it's early in the morning. They bear the mark of the ashes early through the day. So 7 a.m., she had the mark of the ash placed on, or the mark of the cross placed on her forehead, and then went through the day, went off to school. Lo and behold, it was picture day at school. And the photographer said, "Honey, you've got a little dirt right here. You might want to wipe it off." She asked her teacher if she had to. "No, you can do what you want." I don't want to take it off," she said. And she had her school picture made with the mark of the cross right there. When the picture of your life is made, when the picture of your life is made, what mark of Jesus can be found as an ID for you? You see, we are followers of Jesus, and Jesus said that we'll be known as His disciples if we love one another in this kind of lavish, amazing, extravagant love. If we love one another as Jesus has loved us. So I guess the question is, does your appearance match your ID? Pray with me about that.